Hello, everyone. I'm Julie, and I will be teaching the Winter 2023 Digital SAT Reading and Writing Intensive here at Most. To give some background information on myself, I graduated from NYU in 2018, and I have been teaching SAT Reading and Writing, Digital SAT Reading and Writing, as well as other English courses like AP Lang, regular high school literature, and other English courses over the past couple of years. Let's go ahead and get started and go into the brief overview of reading questions. So there are 6 main types here. We can see the first one is going to be words in context. So the words in context, basically, they're asking you to solve vocab questions. So we're looking at the text and seeing, okay, which word of the answer choices is going to fit best accordingly. And so you can see that in the text, it'll be asking you to identify like the key word, phrase, or idea that's going to reinforce the blank word choice so that you can kind of match that answer. So for these ones, you definitely want to make sure your vocabulary is up to par, you're brushed up on that. So make sure to study your vocab. Next question type we have is command of evidence. So command of evidence is split into 2 types, textual and quantitative. So the first one is going to be textual. So the textual here is asking you basically to identify evidence that's going to support a claim. So here in this case, we have support the hypothesis. So the hypothesis is the claim. You want to make sure you can identify the claim first within the text before you go ahead and try to match an answer choice that's going to support that exact claim. The next one we have is going to be the quantitative. So the quantitative is focusing on infographics, right? So infographics are usually going to be graphs or tables, and they're asking you to complete the sentence by using that infographic. We want to first understand the claim. What is the claim within the text? And then you want to read the graph to determine whether the graph is going to correctly or incorrectly reflect the argument. So there are 2 things you need to do, right? You need to be able to understand what the graph is really saying, as well as be able to identify what that claim or argument is. The next one we have is central ideas and details. So again, these split into 2, central idea, which is going to focus on the main idea. So the main idea, right, it should definitely cover the majority of the text, never focus on 1 or 2 sentences, but rather the entirety of the text. If it's too specific, that's never going to be the correct answer. For detail questions, we're looking for specific key clues within the question itself. And that's going to help us point out the specific location in the text that gives us the answer. So in this case, it says, why does David ask about calligraphy? So we want to probably focus on the portion about where David asked about it, but also maybe a little bit before, and because it might tell us David pondered about the importance of calligraphy. So he asked his friend, blah, blah, blah. So it's the fact that he's looking at the importance of calligraphy. That's what is important. That's why he asked about it. So these are some things you want to make sure to keep in mind and look for those key clues or key words that you can identify within the text to help you answer detailed questions. The next one we have is inference. So inference questions, these ones generally are going to ask you logically complete. So this question doesn't really change in terms of like the question itself, but you're looking to make an inference based on the text. So these questions, you basically have to break down the argument into the premise and the conclusion. And generally you want to use the transitional words that come before the blank to help solve these questions. So you want to make sure you're using the evidence or whatever the textual information says and never kind of go beyond that, right? So it should still have relevance to just what the text says. If you go beyond it and add in some like random big picture idea about maybe the subject, but nothing of the details within the text, then generally that's going to be wrong. Next question we have is text structure and purpose. So for structure questions, we're looking usually at the overall structure. So what is the overall structure? Those you want to make sure to separate the ideas and look at how the passage achieves its purpose, right? So don't really think about, okay, what is this saying, but rather look at the big picture, like, oh, he says, if something does this, then something does that. That is a hypothesis. So you have to think about it in a big picture kind of way where, okay, this is the specific details of the hypothesis, but this itself is the hypothesis. That's what you want to make sure you're looking at. So these, you often see these mostly with poems or research types of science questions. And then we also have main purpose. So main purpose, again, big picture here. And what we want to think about is, why is the author writing this? What exactly is he trying to convey to the audience? So not really just what the content says, but extrapolate beyond that and think about, okay, the author wants to convey to us some sort of information. What does he want to convey? What is so important about that? That's what we want for the structure and purpose here. And lastly, we have our cross-text connections. So for cross-text connections, we are comparing the 2 points of view of the 2 texts. You can see here, right? Text 2 describing the view of text 1. So for these ones, we want to make sure we can determine the relationship between the two. That's the most important thing. Do they agree? Do they disagree? Is one expanding on the details of what text 2 said, right? So those are what you want to focus on. Okay, moving on, let's go over the different types of writing questions. So as we can see here, there are 4 types: transition, rhetorical synthesis, form, structure, and sense, as well as boundaries. So for transitions, this is really asking you to connect make the logical transition to connect between the 2 ideas in the passage. Sometimes it'll be the sentence right before the blank and the sentence right after the blank. Sometimes it'll be just the general idea of the passage. So you want to make sure to be able to distinguish what exactly is the important portion, and then you can make the connection. Is this a cause and effect? Is this a contrast? Is this a continuation? It's going to be one of those 3 ideas that you're going to pick out from the answer choices. The next one we have is rhetorical synthesis. So for these ones, these are the ones that have like the long bullet points and then the question. So for these ones, you really want to focus more on the question itself than the bullet. So in this case, right, this portion, this sentence here, this is the important portion. Here it says he wants to emphasize the aim of the study. So this is actually what you want to make sure your answer choice is doing. So for these ones, make sure to accomplish the goal that's stated within the question. This here is going to be that goal that we mentioned. And then after that, you should be able to quickly match accordingly to that goal. And then next one we have is form, structure, and sense. So these ones, we're really just focusing on like the standard English convention. So I've listed out the main types of grammatical concepts that you should be able to learn with me or you have already mastered. So these ones will definitely pop up on the digital SAT. So we have subject-verb agreement, pronoun antecedent, verb tense, subject modifier placement, plural, and possessive nouns. And then the last one we have here is boundaries. So boundaries are going to be focusing on the connections between clauses such as punctuation and non-essential. So as here we have linking clauses. So this one would usually be like, okay, is it going to be connecting to independent clauses? Or is it going to be connecting to dependent clause and independent clause? That's what you want to look for. And then we have supplements. So this is referring to non-essential or essential clauses, right? Is this important information that is relevant to the rest of the text, or can we do without it? Is it just additional information that we do not necessarily need? And then of course we have punctuation, right? Like semicolon, periods, right? When we're writing out a list, can you use the semicolon, or do you need to just use commas? Those kinds of things. So now that we've gone over the different types of questions, let's go ahead and do a couple of examples. Wait, we're going to first do a textual command of evidence question. So of course, before we do anything, we want to make sure to read the entire text, right? So if we look at it, it says, it is surprising that what scientists call multiples, a concurrent discovery of scientific understanding, is actually rather common. In 1922, two researchers compiled a list of multiples and found over 100 major scientific breakthroughs that fit the pattern of simultaneous discovery. Newton and Leibniz, though they were oblivious to each other's work, both discovered calculus. A half-dozen mathematicians claim to have contrived decimal fractions. These researchers came to one conclusion. The sheer number of multiples points to the inexorability of scientific discovery. So, as I've mentioned here, we want to first identify the argument. But if we just look at, usually what we want to do is search for that within the text. But in this case, the question itself has already identified the argument for us. If we look at the question, it says, which finding, if true, would undermine the researcher's argument that the discovery of calculus is an example of multiples? So here they're saying calculus, or the discovery of calculus, is an example of multiples. That's the argument. So first things first, what we want to make sure we understand is, what is multiples? So multiples in the text says it's a concurrent discovery of scientific understanding. So, and that's rather common. So basically, the discovery of calculus happened simultaneously, or happened at the same time. That's what they're saying. And then it says undermine. So we want to be careful of this word. Sometimes it's going to be support or strengthen, or it's going to be undermine or weaken. In this case, undermine, which means weaken here. So that's what we want to do in this case. So we want to create this test phrase. So the test phrase becomes discovery of calculus is not going to be multiples, aka it's not going to be discovered at the same time, right? That's what we're saying. So this discovery of calculus is not discovered at the same time, or happen at the same time. So that's when we want to test the choices, since we have our test phrase here. So going through the answer choices, A, stumbling upon a stash of letters from Leibniz to a scholar society that addressed a presentation of his findings. So it says stumbling upon, that means he found out later, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't discover at the same time, because that was something he found out later. So they could have still made that same discovery. So stumbling implies that there is some sort of surprise, or he didn't know. So it was definitely something that they discovered at the same time potentially, but he just found out later on. So that's why this is going to be wrong. And then if we look at B, learning that other scientists besides Newton and Leibniz had also made contributions to the discovery of calculus. It says that it is other scientists also contributed to the discovery, but of course we want to focus on Newton and Leibniz, who said that they were oblivious to each other's work, that they didn't know about each other's work. But adding more does not make multiples go away, right? Rather, it becomes even more true that it is a multiple, or more people discovered calculus at the same time. So this would not be our answer. And then C, identifying a small fallacy in Newton's original rationale. So here that's saying that Newton's original math logic is going to be wrong, or there's something mistaken with it. But again, that doesn't really make it that it doesn't become a multiple, right? It's still saying that he discovered calculus. Maybe there is something off about it, but at the end of the day, there's still something wrong. So it's still true that they are going to be discovering at the same time. Now, if we look at D, finding formerly unknown correspondences between Leibniz and Newton regarding calculus that took place prior to the date of its commonly assumed discovery. So if we see here, they said that Newton and Leibniz did not even know about each other's work, right? But then here, the correspondences means like the communication. So if you found communication between Leibniz and Newton before the supposed discovery date, that implies that they knew of each other's work. So it's not necessarily that they happened to discover it at the same time, but rather maybe they were working together. Then it doesn't become a multiple, because they're just collaborating on one project, right? So that's why D is going to become our best answer. All right, let's do one more reading. Oops. All right, so if we look at this is going to be a detail question. So first and foremost, we want to read through the text. So it says, when Iris returned home from college and shared her prized urban adventures in an effervescent manner, Abe quietly clattered the shovel around the ice walls of the water hole. He flung a last shovelful. Whilst listening to the stories that were supposed to be the time of her life, he had a faint curl on his lip under his heavy mustache that a person wouldn't notice unless they knew him well. It wasn't clear if his aversion was to the tall buildings, fancy ice cubes, or stories told by his daughter. So we want to make sure to determine the task. So in this case, that's where we look at the question. So according to the text, what feeling does the faint curl to Abe's lip generally reflect? So we want to see this action, what kind of feeling does that mean, essentially? So we want to look for the portion that mentions that. So it says, while listening to the stories, he had a faint curl on his lip. So we know that this has some sort of relevance to the stories here. Now, if we go to the last sentence, this also mentions the stories. And if we read that sentence, it says it wasn't clear if his aversion was to the stories told by his daughter. So that means our clue word as to knowing where exactly or what exactly he's feeling is this aversion. If you know the definition of this word, then you know that aversion is like a strong dislike for something. So that means we want something that is generally going to be a negative word, erring on hatred. So we want to go in and look and predict and illuminate, basically. Look at all of these first words: disapproval, concern, overprotectiveness, and amusement. First, we definitely want a negative word. Now, if we look at B and C, these ones are sometimes can be considered negative, but at the same time, these are more like positive because he's worried. It's a sense of worry, and he wants to make sure that something comes out better than necessarily it might not be. So in this case, concern is not going to be correct, or overprotectiveness is not going to be correct, because these two are going to be too positive. So that's why these are wrong. And then we have A and D, right? And A, we know, is the most negative. It's disapproval. That's closest to the idea of dislike. So A has to be our answer. If we look at amusement, amusement generally means that he's like entertained, right? So this has no relevance to dislike, so it would make sense to eliminate it. And so our best answer choice, where aversion means strong dislike, is equivalent to the disapproval of what he had heard, which is the story. So A has to be our answer. All right, moving on to writing. So we're going to do a transition question. So in this case, we want to make sure this can be reading the sentence, or it can just be about the ideas as well. So if we read, it says, during the early 1900s, the Dutch were fervent cyclists, both riding and producing bicycles in high volume. The flat and populous terrain of their country made cycling a logical choice. So both of these sentences together, they imply that bicycling is popular. And then if we go into the next after the blank, it says, as personal wealth increased in the prosperous post-war years of the 1950s and 60s, the surge in car ownership began to overshadow the popularity of bicycles. So cars are going to become more popular than bicycle, because overshadowing is saying that they're going to overtake. So cars are going to be more popular, and bicycles then are going to be less popular. So we've read these sentences, and now we want to determine the relationship between these two. The relationship is they're obviously going to be contrast, right? Because they were first popular, now they're not popular. That implies that there is an opposite or contrast idea that's going on here. So then we want to identify within these answer choices, which one of these is contrast. And so we should be able to tell right away that it's going to be D. These two are going to be more of a continuation. So continuation, that's usually, in this case, it's going to be basically summarizing the same thing in a different way. And then therefore is going to be cause and effect. Obviously, it's not cause and effect because it's not like the popularity of bicycles is what led to its downfall, right? It doesn't say that anywhere. So that's why D can be our only answer. And then for the last example, we're going to do a rhetorical synthesis question. So in this case, we want to identify the goal. So go ahead and you can read this, but then what we want to focus on really is this portion. You want to emphasize a similarity between the two kinds of sports. Now, we know that it's going to be about team sports as well as individual sports, but we want to see what's similar about them. So we can just go ahead right away after reading through the notes, the choices or the answers. So A, team sports emphasize cooperation while individual sports emphasize depending on oneself. So because of this word while is a contrast word, right? So this is how we can immediately eliminate this answer choice since we're not really looking at the similarity. This is what we want, similarity, but this contrast is opposite. So clearly it's not A. B, players must learn their own strengths and weaknesses, whether playing team or individual. So it says whether. So this implies that you have to be able to do these things, learn their strengths and weaknesses. It doesn't matter if it's playing team or individual. So this makes it seem like it's the one that's closest to the similarity, since it is going to be about this quality you should be able to do in either one. So it seems like B is our best answer, so we'll leave that. C, playing team sports typically leads to a more patient, supportive outlook in general. By saying it's more, it's making that comparison again, but it's not a similarity. It's really a difference, right? Because you're saying one is more patient and supportive, the other one is less. So this one, again, is not really as similar. So C is going to be wrong. And D, one can develop physically and emotionally playing a team sport, but not everyone copes well with the pressures of playing an individual sport. So again, this is a different. It says but. So here you can be developing physically and emotionally, but you can't handle individual. So this one, clearly the but implies that there is a contrast going on. So the only answer choice that really leaves us with that similarity is going to be B. And so B has to be our best answer. So these are the 4 examples that I have gone over with you guys today. Hopefully this was a little bit helpful. And if that's the case, I hope to see you guys in the winter intensive.